Emmaculate Asige Liaga is a Southern Voices African research scholar with the Wilson Center's Africa program. She joins us to talk about her research here on strategies for peace building in post-conflict communities with a focus on South Sudan. Emmaculate, or Emma as we call you around the office, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to begin to ask you about what are the unresolved issues in this region that you're looking at?
Right, so I'm looking at South Sudan currently, and it's a country where there's a lot of conflict going on, and the conflict is not linear. There's so many factors which play into it, so many levels, so many actors. So I'm just looking at the different results that we are getting from the conflict and different ways we can resolve them. So on different levels, there's the national level and the subnational level and the local level. So I'm using those three levels to look at ways in which we can get peace building, but it's so congested and there's so many things going on at the moment.
Is there sort of, when you look at the various ways you can approach a problem, top down or bottom up, is there one way that works best?
Well, no, not really. The conflict nowadays are not as simple or, let me say, as straightforward as they were before, following the international law, and we would almost predict what would happen. Now there are various players that come into a conflict, and some of them are very unpredictable. They come with unpredictable timings. They come with the unpredictable elements in it. So I wouldn't say there is one way of working out or dealing with a conflict. So you have to use always top down and bottom up, work with the government, work with the locals. And that's what I'm advocating for.
I was reading some of the literature that was provided on your work, and I saw this phrase, the local turn.
Right.
What does that mean?
So the local turn is a paradigmatic shift of our focus. We should not only deal with the government in trying to look for conflict resolution. We should not only focus on their methods and on their possibilities in working with the conflict. We should also look at the local organizations, local communities, and their various ways of doing that. And in that, we also get local knowledge of how they solve their own conflict, and we involve them. And in turn, we transfer agency from the international intervention organization, our countries, the states, as we call it, to the local people. And that's also putting sustainability into our peace project. So that's the local turn, focusing more on the local organizations, local knowledge, and bringing them into the peace process that we are supposedly imposing on them.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not just talking about government institutions, you're talking about non-government as well.
Yes, those are the different levels that I work with. A lot of international organizations understand local turn or local organizations as national organizations only. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily have to be governmental. In fact, most of them are almost unknown. They are non-governmental. They are startups with communities. They are church groups or women's groups or youth groups that have nothing to do with the government or do not have a direct link to the government. So they start their own groups, and other local organizations are also governmental, and they receive support, for example, financial support from the government, but most of them, the bulk of them, are not. For example, if you look at the case of South Sudan, most of their conflicts are very communal. Cattle rustling and conflict.
Kidnapping.
Yes, exactly. So there are elders or chiefs who are there who do resolve those problems, and they form their own committees. And from those committees, different organizations come up. And their way of solving those problems might be different from maybe the government or the international community.
How do you begin with all the various interests that you describe, from the central government at the top-down level to individual tribal leaders? How do you begin to bring all of this together into anything that's coherent, where you get enough lines of communication and enough agreement, or at least even the possibility for agreement?
Yeah. Well, the peace building that I'm advocating for is a dynamic peace building, the peace building mechanism that does not only look at one way. So in that, it has to be very diverse. It has to look at different facets. So it has to have different mechanisms of working. With that, you have to streamline your peace building strategies to have, let's say, 5 to 6, 7 arms of looking at things. So if one of the, let's say if it's one organization, if you are looking at the government, part of the same organization should be looking at the local organizations. Part of the same organization should be looking at church communities. So basically, I am advocating for peace building mechanisms from organizations to be very, very aggressive, to be very strong, to be very...
Do you see a role for any sort of coordinating committee? Or what I'm just trying to figure out is I get all the sort of individual
Right.
concerns that you're describing, and the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all
Yeah.
solution.
Yes.
But is there any way to coordinate all of it?
Well, one of the ways we are looking at coordinating is through the government and through middle-level organizations. That is, for example, the government and mid-level non-governmental organization who have links to both the grassroots organization and the governmental organization. So if international organizations of peace building link with those middle-level organizations, they can actually have some form of coordination with, they partner with this organization and they find a synchronized way of working with projects which maybe they have in common, or projects which they don't have in common, they can adapt them. So with partnerships, with collaboration, there could be some form of coordination exercise.
Is there any leadership that you can identify that is sort of taking the lead in this area, whether it be from the international community or a local level, some place where people are sort of rallying the forces, thinking about it the way that you're recommending, and beginning a process?
Right. There is a variety of organizations currently, for example, in the United States, which is working on this. For example, the USAID is also working from this angle, where they do involve the local organizations, especially in the Bahr-el-Ghazal region of South Sudan. There's also Search for Common Grounds, which are working with the local organizations. They are empowering them. They are doing different kinds of training for them to build up their capacity to a level where they can equally do the work which international organizations are. There's also an organization from South Africa called LACOD, is also working with the building of the capacity of local organizations. So there are some work already going on, and it's beautiful work, and it's doing a lot of changes in South Sudan. But we're still advocating for more, because international community does form a big part of the peace building initiatives happening in South Sudan, and most of their initiatives are top down, and thus excluding a lot of the local organizations who are left untrained, and they cannot compete. And at the end of the day, their efforts cannot really make a big change, while it's still important.
Emma, when you talk in terms of more, and relate that to capacity building, are we talking about more training or more funding, or some combination of all of the above?
Well, in the case of South Sudan, I think you have to talk of everything. They still need for more funding. They still need for more training. For example, something as simple as writing a proposal for funding, or even a website for a local organization. Those are skills that some of them might be lacking.
Things that people might take for granted.
Exactly, things that you might take for granted. Or even just having a structure, or knowing how to manage the organizations they're running. Sometimes they go years working on this project that they have, and they do not have, a step-by-step mechanism of going through it, making it successful and increasing their impact.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, you please finish.
On all levels, I think it's important, but most of all is financial resources.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't necessarily say that's the most or the only important thing. So organizations should focus on everything, on all levels.
A final thought I want to ask you about is the stability of the government, and how that factors into the equation, especially when you start talking about a need for more resources or things like that. When you have a central government that is struggling to maintain a certain level of stability,
right?
How much of a handicap is that in trying to get anywhere close to a solution?
That's actually one of the main arguments, that because the government alone is not capable of leading to peace in South Sudan, and we've seen that from all the peace agreements that have not been implemented. The locals have to be empowered to either stand up against the government or demand some form of action from the government. So the instability within the structures of the government and the leadership is actually bringing a focus on the local group. Where else can we get an alternative to push for peace? So if we only focus on the government, which is important, and there is need to focus on the government, focus from the top down, that should not be ignored. But still, that is not the only way, especially in the case of South Sudan, where there's a variety of local organizations working. So the disunion of the government and the leadership actually pushes us to look for alternatives, and that's where we should focus on. If you look at the peace agreements that they signed in 2015, which actually asked for a coalition government and which did not happen, just small things like that actually, pushes us to think of other alternatives. Yeah.
I like it, thinking outside the box.
Yes,
Thank you.
exactly.
Well, I hope your time here at the Wilson Center has been worthwhile for you.
Yes, it has. It has taught me a lot. Actually, the other day I held a focus group, and we discussed all the issues concerning the conflict in South Sudan, and within the conflict group, we are supposed to talk about the local organizations, but most of the focus is on the government. So the focus group members, who are mostly South Sudanese, were actually disappointed with the government's non-action. So I've learned quite a lot in the Wilson Center, especially to do with my research. I've gained a lot of perspective, and I hope that my research will impact some of the activities going on in South Sudan.
As do we.
Yes.
That would be fantastic.
Thank you.
Emma, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.